So looking at Laguna Woods Village, this is just an infographic. It's visual. Many of you have seen this before. This is not anything new. And this looks at kind of, there's the three mutuals. You've got United, you've got Third, you've got 50. You have GRF, and we're going to talk in great detail what these look like. And then you have underneath that in the operations that are a part of the managing agent, facilities and maintenance, transportation, television and broadband service, recreation, classes and programming, administrative services, landscape and composting, and financial services. There are subcommittees under some of these groups, and in many of them, but the latest information and greatest information I had at the time was that this is the general structure of the organization. That's a quick infographic. It's a high level. So we'll start with 50. It is a nonprofit condominium housing corporation with special in-house services and an on-site manager. There's 311 memberships, and there are 5 directors on that board. Now, the bylaws for each mutual are slightly different because they're different types of corporations and entities. Some are corporations, some aren't. This is where it gets a little tricky because you're all working together, you're all under the same community, but there's different bylaws, there's different CC&Rs, and it shifts. The key to this, and I'm putting this in here, this is ripped straight from the bylaws. They're pulled right from it. But really, what is it in terms of the director's roles and responsibilities in 50? It's to establish monthly and other assessments as provided by the restrictions and bylaws. So it's evaluating and understanding where assessments need to be made. It's to engage agents or employees for the management of the corporation under such terms as the board may determine. Let me clarify. The role is not to manage them, it's to engage people to manage the process and property. To promulgate rules and regulations pertaining to the rights and obligations of mutual members in the use of occupancy of common areas. For disciplining members as provided in these bylaws and the rules regulations of the corporation. In taking all appropriate action that the board of directors deems necessary to carry out and exercise the purposes and power of the corporation as set forth by the articles, bylaws, and restrictions and other applicable laws. Those applicable laws are changing regularly, and we know that. We see that happening. It's important to, when you look at the key words here, it's about assessments, it's about engaging agents for management, it's about rules and regulations, it is about some discipline, and taking action. It's really taking the rules, understanding them, and setting a direction. Making long-term decisions, short-term decisions that affect at the very highest level your organization. These are the committees that I last heard existed. Again, oops, skipped it. There's the Architect Committee, which was deemed the committee of the whole. The Marketing Committee, Finance, Orientation, and Activities. So for those who have gotten to this point in this orientation and they may say, oh, board is not for me, and they're at 50, maybe participating in a committee is a great first step in the right direction. Maybe they still want to move forward either way. The next one is Third. It's a not-for-profit mutual benefit housing corporation that manages, operates, and maintains the common area property within the original 38 mutuals. Each condo owner is required to pay for common expenses and contribute to reserves. The common expenses and reserve contributions are established by the board of directors. There's about 6,100 condominium memberships and 11 directors on that board. The third director, bylaws. And there's a whole paragraph, which I will not read all of it because that's the legalese, to say your responsibilities are establishing and rejecting membership applications, establishing monthly assessments, engaging agents or employees for the management of the corporation, disciplining mutual members, promulgating rules and regulations, and notifying residents of rule changes. Those are the outlined essential responsibilities. The committee lists, which are a little bit longer. Board Operating Rules Committees, like the committees over there. Communications Committee, Electrical Vehicle Charging Ad Hoc Committee, an Energy Committee, Executive Committee, the Finance Committee, Garden Villa Recreation Room Subcommittee, the Laguna Woods Village Traffic Hearings, Landscape, Maintenance and Construction, the Meet and Confer, wasn't sure on that one. Can somebody clarify what that one is?
IDR.
What?
Internal discipline.
Oh, it's internal discipline. Okay, great. New residence orientation. It sounds so nice when you put it that way. Resident problem resolution services, slope renovation, turf conversion subcommittee, standard subcommittee, and the Laguna Canyon Foundation. And then there's United. So it's a not-for-profit cooperative housing corporation which owns and manages all real property within the 21 cooperative mutuals. In a cooperative, shareholders are members of a corporation which owns all of the real property, including the dwellings, units, carports, laundry facilities within the mutual's boundaries. And each member is entitled to occupy a specific dwelling unit under the terms of occupancy agreement. 6,300 approximately memberships with 11 directors that are voted. The bylaws, when you get to it, again, there's legalese on the top, but it really comes down to accepting and rejecting membership, establishing monthly carrying charges, engaging persons and entities for management of property, managing occupancy agreements, disciplining members, establishing rules, regulations, or policies pertaining to the property of the corporation, and informing residents of rule changes. That is what is outlined as the responsibilities. The United Committees, listed as Finance, Governing Documents, Laguna Woods Village Traffic Hearings, Landscape, Maintenance and Construction, New Resident, Parking Committee, Resident Advisory Committee, United Energy, and Water Conservation. There's one more board, and this is the one that gets a little bit murkier, I think more so for the residents, where there's a lot of confusion on what this looks like. Everyone's laughing. This one's a little harder to understand, so we're going to spend a little time getting into how this works, just so people coming in, again, I know this may be a review for many of you, which is the Golden Rain Foundation Board. It's a California nonprofit corporation. It oversees the management and maintenance of facility services within community. GRF Board confirms committee charters and appoints GRF members to serve as chair and vice chair of standing committees. They consider recommendations from the standing committees and by resolution adopt governing rules and regulations, annual budgets, and appropriation of funds. There are 11 directors, and these are nominated, not elected by the residents, but they are nominated by a committee of the mutual directors. Okay, so the bylaws, which we're going to have a little section about right now. I'm going to caveat this again. Not an attorney. Don't purport to be one. I'm reporting what was there for educational purposes because as we discussed in building this, that if we didn't address this in the training, people may be confused. This is at a very high level. I also am aware, and there are notes in here, that there is current legislation going on and there are things happening that could be changing this. So this is as it stands right now as it's reported, and there are areas where it's noted that there's active legislation about some of these things. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but before we get there, I want to talk about the committees. The committees for GRF are Business Planning, the Club 2 Renovation Ad Hoc Committee, Community Activities, Energy, Finance, Financial Reporting Study Group, Landscape, Maintenance and Construction, Media and Communications, Mobility and Vehicles, Administrative Process and Procedures, Ad Hoc Committee, Security and Community Access, as well as Traffic. Had multiple people come in the last, I understand, 2 years, explaining, reviewing what the trust looks like and how GRF was set up. Reading these documents made my head spin. I think I read the trust in its entirety 2 or 3 times. It's an interesting, it's an atypical business model. It's out there, but it's not something that a lot of people see every day. which is why it can be confusing and complicated, especially to just community members who have never taken the time to really know about it and understand how it works. So, GRF is actually a business trust. It's an agreement that was set up for the control and management of assets and property. It's a type of trust that trustees who take responsibility for management of the assets, and that's really key there. It's managing the assets of the trust, and we'll look at what those assets are. The trustees manage the assets not for their own gain or benefit, but for the benefit or one or more of the trustors and beneficiaries. And we're going to define who those are in a second as well. Why was this established? And I think this is really important to understand. So the trust was established to meet the requirements to finance the project that was known as Leisure World at the time, Laguna Hills. Really, it was to make sure that when the community was built, it wasn't just built because you can't just build it once and walk away. It was to make sure that the community continued to grow, evolve, and be maintained, and would continue to meet the needs of residents, because over 50 years, the needs of residents have changed. I'm guessing when it was built, it would have blown everyone's minds to think that there would be internet access with computers in most people's homes and wireless floating everywhere. And 10, 15 years from now, we'll probably be blown away by the changes that were needed we couldn't even predict right now. So the Golden Rain Foundation was incorporated in 1962 to provide services and community facilities to the housing corporations of Laguna Hills. The incorporating and early directors of GRF were originally employees, and the first resident was elected to GRF in 1966. So it took a few years during the building and development so that the developers were running it and executing their vision before it was turned over to residents to help run. The trust agreement. It was created with GRF board as a trustee. It was not yet owner occupied at the time. Mutual One is the member and trustor beneficiary. So basically, none of the lenders would have funded the development, and nor would FHA have insured the loans without knowing that the future of this organization was protected. They had to know that it wasn't going to be building it and walking away. They needed to know that in order to build it, someone or some people in the future would be responsible for maintaining and developing the investment that was being made. And it was just a financial security, so it just didn't build it, walk away, and then the bank would have been at a loss potentially. So it was insurance for them. So this is the interesting one. Who owns the trust? So the trust is wholly owned by the mutuals. It is an asset. It's an asset of the mutuals. GRF does not own the trust. What GRF does is executes it and manages it to maintain it. They manage the trust assets for the benefit of the mutuals. So the trust is actually what makes GRF unique. There's a trustee and assets, and then you have the trustors and the beneficiaries. And the beneficiaries are United, Third, and Towers. So here's where it gets very legalese. So what is the role? The trustee has the duty to administer the trust. GRF's job is to administer the trust according to the trust agreement, the instrument. It is solely to the interest of beneficiaries. That is their role. And if the trust has two or more beneficiaries, it has the duty to deal impartially. This is informational. And again, as with any legal document, it's living, it's breathing, and things shift and change. And as the laws shift and change, and interpretations shift and change, that's why we have a court system to help us adjust and address those issues. That's being handled externally. What's interesting about GRF is it actually has a dual role, and this is really what makes it so unique. It actually is a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation. They operate as a corporation, a not-for-profit. They also operate as a trustee of an estate. That is unique. And this is where a lot of people have a hard time in the community understanding this because they see it as one or the other. And why it's challenging to execute this because GRF does operate as both. So when you look at, we're going to look at what the definitions are specifically in these two. This is the legal agreements that were built. As trustors, the mutuals have provided all the funding to acquire, construct the planned community facilities and off-site improvements. That is the assets that are there. As trustors, that's their job, is to manage it how it's seen best fit for the community. As beneficiaries, the mutuals must provide continuing funding to pay the expenses of the trustee administering the operations of the trust. What is included in the estate, though? All trustee sums received from the mutuals, those are to become the trustors or beneficiaries. All parcels of land and improvements acquired or constructed. All sums paid to the trustee by the mutuals to cover cost and maintenance of the improvements, and any money or property held or received by the trust. All of that is to be managed by GRF. What those are, again, I understand there's debate. So what does the trust actually do? The trust is going to guarantee community administration. Their job is to make sure that everything is still operating in the community property. They are to provide recreation services, ensure maintenance of community property, and protect the community property for the beneficiaries. So it's not just day-to-day management, it's long-term. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about it. It shouldn't be a lot of management, period. It's governance and decision-making about those assets, and managing comes from the managing agent, because one of the duties is to have a managing agent in place. The role of the trustee is to perform all acts contemplated as necessary or desirable to carry out the plan and operations of the trust agreement. That means that they're not just hastily done. That contemplating part that's legally built in there to make sure everyone is doing their due diligence, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. Providing annual financial reports to the mutuals detailing the operations, and retaining all funds that are part of the trust estate in a separate bank account. The role of the trustee, they shall have, in addition to all powers, rights, and privileges provided by the law and trustees, all powers necessary to carry out the duties imposed on the trustee by the trust assessment, and in all such cases, the trustee shall have, and it's starred, underlined, sole discretion. This is also something that is currently being discussed. So I put in the bottom, the bylaws have been amended to restrict GRF's sole discretion to that of the trust agreement amendment has been signed by 3 of the 4 corporations, but will not be effective until the signature of the 4th. This sole discretion is being discussed as this living document continues to grow and breathe. In respect to all transactions, the trustee shall have no liability except for willful and wrongful misconduct. And we're going to look at what that means and explore that a little bit further, because that gets into the ethics. What are the duties of corporate trustees? This is a little bit different than board directors, okay? But if people are serving on GRF or are interested, it is a dual role. And this is the list of them. We're going to talk about them just for a couple minutes each. The duties of the corporate trustees are to administer a trust, delegation by a trustee, keeping and rendering accounts, furnishing information, exercising reasonable care and skill, and managing the trust property, as well as impartiality. And we're going to look at what that looks like. So knock that over. The duty to administer trust is the starting point of the relationship. It's the administration of it. It's under, all of these are done under the obligations of loyalty, good faith, prudence, and impartiality. All those things we talked about that make a good board director, they show up as a trustee as well. When a delegation of a trustee, that means a trustee has an affirmative duty to not delegate doing the doing of acts he can reasonably be required to personally perform. So, in some cases as a trustee, people have, shirked responsibility and handled it over. This is not the case as much as I've seen here in our time spent. It's making sure that due diligence is done in doing the work that you were committed to doing. Keeping and rendering accounts. This is the duty to the beneficiaries to keep clear and accurate records of transactions. It's making sure that any trust matters are made available and open when it comes to financial transactions. Furnishing information. It's the right of beneficiaries to receive a copy of trusts, typically along with detailed information of material facts, accountings, and transactions. Again, The bylaws of the trust may legally have very specific things said or stated that could or may not be changing. So it's important to look at that. This is just general information about trustees to show the difference between governance and being a trust board and being a trustee. Trustees have, just like a board member, they have to exercise reasonable care and skill in executing their duties and responsibilities. Is it researched? Taking control of the trust property. Trustee is obligated to take reasonable steps to secure control of the property and keep it. Trustee needs to make sure that the designation of the property that is owned by the trust is in its care. And then impartiality. A trustee has the responsibility to administer the trust to afford beneficiaries the allocated, I'll use that word, resources that are needed. This is general, and if you look at this, you see a slight difference between being a trustee and being a board member. So it's really important to realize that those who are serving on GRF have a different set of duties as well as the same set of duties at the same time. There is a lot of overlap, but it is a slightly different role than serving on a traditional board for one of the mutuals. I'm going to take a few questions here before we take a break, but I'm going to give it with the warning that if it's about legal issues or understanding and interpreting the documents, that is something best to have the conversation with your board president, whichever board that is, and they can talk to the attorneys about that. This was just a general overview. The question was, is there a conflict of interest between the two roles? Some would argue yes, and some would say no. That's one that I think is, the trust was set out to write to prevent that from happening. But typically, legally, they try and put parameters to keep that from happening. There is so much overlap between the two, though.